Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to On the Defense. If this is your first time here, you've landed on a podcast that looks at the intersection of cybersecurity and finance. And this episode's guest has spent almost her entire career in that very intersection. Shameela Gonzalez, Executive Director and Financial Services Lead at CyberCX. In this discussion, Shameela expertly dissects the scams that are most likely to impact businesses and finance leaders, as well as the very much psychological aspect of cybercrime. And she also weighs in on a pretty tricky topic right now: liability, or put more simply, who wears the blame when scammers succeed. I definitely learned a lot, so have a listen and stay safe. Hi, Shameela.
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us today. It's so amazing to talk to you. And one of the reasons why it's so great to talk to you is because this podcast, of course, is very focused on cybercrime and fraud. And you have extensive experience in financial services and understanding scams. So can you explain to us a little bit about your current role, your current organization, and how you ended up with a focus here?
Yeah, so it's not a path I chose. I think it's a path that chose me. So after almost 10 years working for one of the major financial institutions in Australia, I joined an organisation called CyberCX, and that's where I've been for the last 2 years. And I look after the vertical that is all to do with financial services. So that's all of the major banks, the mid-tier banks, the neo-banks, as well as alongside the superannuation and the insurance industry as well. So I really get to appreciate the full spectrum of financial services in Australia, New Zealand, and a little bit in the UK and the US as well, where we're based. And predominantly in my role, I'm at the forefront of doing really two things. One is if there is a large-scale cybercrime attack that these organisations are fallen victim of, my job is to help strategically advise them out of that and mitigate that situation. It is to help with that general incident response and advise a lot of the executives and sometimes their boards on the consequences of that attack and what decisions to make in the wildfire. The second is helping mitigate against those from happening in the first place. So a lot of it is on prevention, and a lot of them is about embedding the right strategies to mitigate the potential of them in the first place, but also if they were to fall under attack, how would they best be able to defend themselves through that situation? Through that experience, there's a full spectrum of, criminal activity and behaviour that you then become exposed to. That's anywhere from large-scale data breaches, large-scale malware and ransomware attacks, where we see sometimes big brands being taken down for several days into weeks. But some of that actually is to do with the financial ecosystem and payments. A lot of it can actually be large-scale fraud syndicate crime. A lot of it can be large-scale financial theft, and it could involve either the organisation having undergone a lot of financial theft, or it could be their customers. So yeah, it's been a wild ride of 2 years being able to support that industry with a number of our customers, and getting to see at the forefront of what that cyber criminal activity and that behaviour actually looks like, and the methods and the techniques that they use.
Right. So you've basically got a front row seat to a lot of the cybercrime and a lot of the scams that we often talk about in theory. You're kind of seeing the actual inner workings and the actual aftermath of a lot of these incidents. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We've got a dedicated large forensics team, for example. So when there is a victim organisation, we've got subject matter experts that go in there and actually scan the organisation. So they're physically looking at the footprints that criminals have either left behind or are live still in a network within an organisation, trying to propagate that attack and sort of further the impact of it. Sometimes it starts from something as simple as a phishing email or exploiting some kind of a technical vulnerability. But once a criminal is in, they're into your organisation. They see everything. When we're there responding to that incident, our forensics team then get to see the entire footprint. We get to see how they move laterally through our organisation. I remember one incident where, whilst we were there actually helping mitigate the attack, we saw the threat actor actually imitate an employee and get onto a Teams chat with an employee, trying to convince them to change financial account details. And we saw this live. So yeah, you really do get to go face to face into the forefront of seeing that criminal actually propagate. The only difference is in the cybercrime world, of course, they could be anywhere in the world and you don't physically get to see them, but you can very much get in touch with some of their tactics.
Right. Yeah, that's almost kind of creepy, knowing that you're not just seeing like the real world effects and seeing, exactly how a crime unfolded, but you're actually maybe even witnessing like a real time like incident. That's almost, like I said, almost a little bit creepy. So basically you've got just kind of unparalleled insight and view into how a lot of these cyber crimes actually happen. And I feel like I've heard you speak quite a bit about scams that are a little bit more consumer focused. So on the Girls Talk Cyber podcast, also a great podcast, just a little plug for no reason. But you spoke with them about a lot of scams that, are really common in Australia. But I think a lot of times when we're talking about scams, which, a lot of cybercrime is around scams. And what we are often wondering about is the difference between the consumer scams and the ones that are a bit more focused on going after organizations or businesses as their targets. What would you say are some of the most common scams or the types of scams or cybercrimes that you see targeting businesses rather than individual consumers?
Yeah, I think it's a great topic to get into because you're right. There is so much out there when we talk about individual consumer-based scams. Like I was talking about romance scams or investment scams. The minute you try to hone in on what actually impacts businesses, and businesses in Australia are made up of mum and dad businesses all the way up to large enterprise. So it's a very, very broad spectrum. I think the ACCC reported something like $30 million was lost just by businesses to scams. And what worries me about that figure is it sounds big, but that's only the numbers that have been reported. And I think the damage is potentially a lot bigger than that. That doesn't actually go publicly reported or something that is available as a data point to us. So for likelihood, it could be a lot bigger than that in terms of impact. Businesses from a cybercrime point of view, I'd probably start with they're always going to be a very lucrative target. The aim and the ultimate motivation, the driver for a cyber criminal, whether they're an individual or whether they're operating as part of a larger group and a sophisticated group, is always financial gain. And any dollar they gain is a free dollar in their pockets, right? Then when you kind of step back and think about, well, what would be the type of scam that you could propagate towards individuals? It requires a really targeted effect and a real targeted methodology. And when you think about businesses, especially those that are quite successful, they might be well known, the opportunity size is enormous. And so if you put yourself in the shoes of a cyber criminal, it's almost like a why not? Why not go after a business? One differentiator I often tell people about is for me to launch a targeted scam to you, for example, it requires me to find out as much as I can about you, because the more I know about you, the more contextualized it's going to be, the more likely I can target you with something you're likely to fall for. And that's a really important point about scams that's worth noting is unlike a large-scale, technical cyber attack or even just like identity theft, the reason why scams are such a difficult and such a strenuous attack type is because it's so intrinsically about manipulating you. And ultimately, the perpetrator is convincing you to take that action. You're the one that's making, let's say, the transaction. You're the one sending that information. So from a criminal point of view, all I have to do is do something really convincing to get you over the line. So it's incredibly psychological, actually, when you come down to it. A lot of it is mystified with like deeply technology-based discussion. A lot of what's missing is a conversation about the psyche behind it. And fundamentally sitting behind every business is a bunch of people that are still as susceptible as an individual could be. So when we start talking about business-based scams, I think the first thing to talk about or hone in on is one, the scam is about the art of manipulation, and two is why wouldn't businesses be a lucrative target? Again, back to the analogy of if I was coming after you, I'd have to go after what I could find out about you and create a bit of a footprint about the individual and then design a really lucrative scam. If I'm doing it about a business, if you think about how much is publicly available about a business, especially one that, let's say, is in the e-commerce business or the retail business, the more information they put out about themselves, the more they're trying to market themselves and be attractive to consumers. Unfortunately, that's all a digital footprint that a criminal has access to and quite easily. So therefore, we could make some really good assumptions about your organizational structure, the key personnel in your business, the types of conversations you probably have inside your business and the types of key decisions you're making. The one that I often talk about with organizations is the larger scale ones. They often signal things like large mergers and acquisitions that they're interested in doing. That's a really popular time for criminals to sort of be digging into their research about you because you're making a large financial transaction. You're probably researching a large number of organizations. So when it comes to businesses, there's just so much avenue and so much of a footprint for a criminal to sort of work around.
Yeah, wow. So it sounds like it's such a mix of, you mentioned the psychological element of things. And I think that's something that gets lost when we talk about some of the more business-to-business scams, which is that, you can kind of talk about AP processes, et cetera, which sounds like there's maybe even more information. It's more easily accessible than the average person on the street, information about them. But then on top of that, like you mentioned, these businesses are made up of, well, individual humans who are going to be motivated by a lot of the same weaknesses or imperfections or moments of weakness that any person falling for a consumer scam might be subject to as well. So I'm wondering, how do these types of scams work? So we know that there is that psychological element. We've also heard about hackers, for instance, who have no technical expertise, but they're able to kind of go into the industry just by using psychological manipulation and being really good at impersonation or getting people to do what they want to do. So we know that that's an element of it. But how would they work in a business, for instance? Like, let's say hypothetically, some common type of scam tactic. What would that actually look like in an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So cyber criminals, absolutely. They've got a much lower barrier to entry now than they've ever had before. Just like you and I have access to tools like ChatGPT, we've heard of stories like a fraud GPT, fraud as a service. All of these tools that are like available through the dark web, unfortunately mean there doesn't need to be a high level of a technical aptitude for some of these criminal groups to access tools. And some of these custom-built tools means they get to actually propagate a lot of this at a larger scale and a volume that previously would have required them to do this with a lot of manual effort and have a level of technical expertise to be able to execute. Bearing that in mind, the types of scams that we see the most for businesses are going to be pretty obvious. One of them is business email compromise, and there's a lot in that to unpack as well, but predominantly we see that as a very large vector that impacts businesses. Any type of fraudulent activity that happens with regards to payments, it can actually come through so many different avenues and types. So, for example, a very common one is disrupting the supply chain and imitating supply chain type of invoices, or it could be the imitation of like a tech support organization to then get their hands on your credentials and get some level of privileged access into your business. Imitating a customer or imitating a third party. A lot of these things are what businesses end up being subject to the most. And then there's still some traditional methods that are the same for consumers that apply to businesses. So all of those spear phishing campaigns that ultimately get you by, target an individual, require that level of research. We see a lot of particularly executives and high-profile individuals in businesses getting targeted with those. And the technology and the methodology is exactly the same as what you see for individuals. So there's some scam types that will be the same, that individuals are recipients of, that would be targeted towards businesses. But the more specific one towards businesses often includes some level of disruption towards some kind of a payment activity. That's always the underlying method, but that's also because the underlying motivation is always financial theft. So businesses will have such a complex hierarchy and set of processes on where their payments occur. And if you think about it, a business sort of sits in the middle between a complex ecosystem where they're interconnected deeply with so many other businesses in order for them to run and operate, whether that's your technology provider, whether that's any other supplier, whether it's how you even meaningfully connect and interact with your customers and different types of customers. All of that ecosystem is just a connected web. And for a cyber criminal, all they have to do is intercept or disrupt any of that web. So as long as they have an avenue in, that'll be a gateway for them to be able to exploit.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so complicated as well, because, it's not just about one organization's cybersecurity policy or, how well-trained their employees might be in preventing or recognizing incidents or scam attempts, for instance. It's sometimes about who else has been compromised within that ecosystem and that supply chain. Yeah. And I think I think if I were a financial leader, that's what would keep me up at night the most, is thinking it's not just our organization, but it's also every organization we interact with. And when we talk about the they behind these scams, I feel like we often kind of think about hackers or cyber criminals as these, rogue agents. But you mentioned criminal syndicates. Yeah. Are those the groups who are often perpetuating these cyber crimes? We also hear about nation state actors, et cetera. What sort of groups or what sort of perpetrators do you often kind of see or connect to these sorts of incidents?
Yeah, in the world of scams and a lot of financial theft, yes, it's absolutely possible to see nation states, but we often see that nation state motivated groups look for disruption. and they look for, like, let's say, corporate espionage. So they're in there really looking to break into an organization and either scrape and steal large amounts of that information for some kind of, geopolitical means or propagated because of some geopolitical tension. But in the world of scam and particularly fraud, it's a lot more driven by individual criminal groups. And quite frankly, they're located anywhere in the world. We hear reports of them from almost every continent where these get exposed. And it is incredibly difficult, actually, in the first instance, for authorities to even be able to locate some of them because they're obviously not publicizing themselves. They're not hosting where they're from. But it doesn't, because of the deeply interconnected world that we live in now, location almost doesn't matter for a lot of these criminal groups. They can target any region from anywhere where they're based. What is interesting is I follow a lot of reports on when these criminals have been unmasked and when authorities have successfully been able to identify them and arrest them. And it's interesting to follow that trail and just see how many of these stories pop up around the world. The one I heard about, early this year is an example that I think is great for people to know about, but it also highlights how these operations are and how they run. Is I think the Philippines arrested something like 400 people in one go. And what was interesting about that was they were running a scam center. And this is one thing that we try and demystify for a lot of people a lot of the time is, yes, you can imagine that guy in a hoodie in a dark basement, and that is still one sort of criminal type that definitely exists. I know in Australia, the AFP have arrested individuals that have just been trying to propagate these alone. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not difficult to imagine someone being able to do this alone because some of those technology services that are available on the dark web mean it kind of is at your fingertips and you could theoretically do it on your own. But the more sophisticated groups run and operate kind of like businesses. They have departments, they have coordinated groups, they work together. Often in the world of, let's say, pure data breaches, a lot of what I'm advising organizations about in terms of like what's the ultimate motivation is independent criminal groups actually are an industry of their own. So the types of groups that have specialized in, let's say, being able to just steal data, they've got certain methodologies and techniques that are proven and they work. What they do is they're able to steal that large amounts of data and as well as threatening that victim organization for some kind of like monetary value out of it and holding them to a ransom, they're also able to then go and sell that data set to other criminal groups who are really looking for that data and wanting to use it for their own benefit to then be able to launch a large scale of scams. So here in Australia, when we heard about those large data compromises a few years ago, for me, the immediate concern, yes, is, oh my God, there are Australians out there that have had their, ID documents and things stolen. But the next concern, and I'd say the more serious one, is what scams are they now going to be receiving? What kind of targeted fraudulent activity are they going to be the victims of, where the loss is not just going to be about, your driver's license or your data, it's actually going to be about financial theft, which is a terrifying consequence. So criminal groups fundamentally can operate out of anywhere. They can operate as niche and as small and as independently as individual-based because they are able to access tools and be able to do this now single-handedly. But a large amount of the time we see them operate in larger sophisticated organisations and groups. And in some instances, as I've mentioned, there are situations where they're running quite sophisticated centres and they're in a hidden location. So I think as 2025 and 2026 nears, we will see probably more of these arrests as authorities are collaborating on a global scale a lot more. But we will see these come out of almost anywhere in the world.
Yeah, when you said scam center, like that was my first thought. Was like, what does a scam center look like? It doesn't just look like any other like office building, or like what does that entail? Because it sounds like you're saying some of these organizations are like very complex and have like their own HR department or what have you. Yeah,
they do. And in terms of what they look literally like an office. They look like a call center. They look like a real imitation of no different from any other international call center that we know what they look like. It's interesting for me because back down to the psychological component of it, it's just a symptom of the fact that we work better together as humans when we're physically located together. And so when you think about criminal groups, they're collaborating. They're real-time, agile, collaborating with each other. And these people who are there and operating these scam centers, they come in every day just like we do in a job, but being paid to go out there and find victims. It's just hunting for victims. It's hunting for revenue. Yeah. It's eerily like a mirror reality of what our real businesses look like, but just in a criminal format. These are not necessarily dark, seedy, cave-based instances. These are people in clean, sophisticated-looking offices, which I think for us as a learning and as an insight just shows how much money there is to gain out of these. and how much of a business it is to run some of these things, and how lucrative it is fundamentally.
Right. Yeah. Like you mentioned, this is a full-fledged industry.
Yeah.
And a lucrative one at that. You mentioned proven methodologies and proven tactics. That kind of brings me to my next question about timing.
Yeah.
And what sort of timing, like what role does timing play, particularly for leaders who might be, kind of working with maybe, varied headcounts or varied budgets might change, et cetera, when they're looking at their resources and when they should be on alert, whether that's a time period that's universal or maybe specific to their market or their country, or maybe even something a little bit more individual to that particular organization.
Yeah.
Are there periods that are riskier or that, scammers are maybe more likely to deploy some of these tactics?
Yeah.
And if so, what do they look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So in order to answer this question in terms of what time periods throughout the calendar year is important for businesses to think about, unfortunately, it's not a black and white answer. So that's the short answer up front. I wish there was, but there isn't. So I'll start by saying, unfortunately, it's around the clock business for criminals. They are always operating. They don't take holidays. And from my experience in the cyber industry in particular, whenever we take a break, that's when they get active, unfortunately. So we always caution businesses to be on high alert during holiday periods. And I'll expand on that in a little bit. But when it comes to specifically what should organizations think about during those periods, it's probably good to deep dive from one specific type of scam that I've noticed for businesses. One that's been propagating a lot has been things like fake domains and fake websites. And this is really concerning for me when it comes to businesses because they put so much investment and so much of their stock into, establishing a critical way for basically consumers to interact with them. And let's say, especially if you're an e-commerce business and that's your lifeline, is your consumers being able to immediately access you, make purchases and have a seamless experience, which is the fundamental of any e-commerce business. The fact that we have criminal groups being able to basically imitate those and spoof them and do them in a really quick and low-cost manner is a little bit of a terrifying reality. The reason why it's really important to think about that, and remember that spoofing is quite simple and easy because all of that data that you have published on your website is readily available to be scraped. So it's really easy to impersonate and spin that up with a lot of minimal effort, probably helped by the likes of being able to use AI and other tools like that help automate and be able to do them a lot faster. And from a consumer's point of view, sometimes really difficult to detect. If the imagery and everything else that we use as our first line of sanity checking is all there, then sometimes the difference can be as simple as one character on that domain and that website. So for the average consumer, it might be quite difficult actually to be able to recognize. Whereas before, phishing attempts and spoofing attempts were a little bit easier because it was spelling errors and images didn't look quite high quality. We don't really have that issue anymore as criminals have become more sophisticated. So when we think about that as like a real criminal activity and a potential threat to a lot of e-commerce based businesses as an example, when you think about then, well, how do we defend against it and what do I need to think about? The first thing I always think about is, well, what's the pattern where your consumer is going to be interacting with you the most? If you think about just the last calendar year, I'm sure every Australian can probably resonate with this, but we were bombarded. Black Friday, a Cyber Monday, through to Christmas, through to Boxing Day, through to New Year's Day, the sales cycle was relentless. And we received countless text messages, emails, social media ads, you name it. And through that channel is such a high volume of activity for a business. And if you're a smaller scale business that's reliant on, let's say, a smaller size team and a smaller scale of operations, when you're confronted with that volume with your customers, it's a really busy time. And you're focused on just making those sales happen. When you think about then a criminal's perspective, they're thinking, great, this is a great time for you to be incredibly busy, potentially incredibly distracted. And again, back to that human behavior element, your guard's probably going to be low. You're going to be making some really rapid decisions based on really, really short time constraints. So could this be the best time for me to be able to imitate one of your suppliers and send you an invoice and hope that those checks and balances that you might normally do during a slower period, you might not do? You might overlook that slight spelling error in that email address and maybe send through that transaction that you shouldn't have. Things like that. So when I think about high peak periods, any time where there's a really significant period where you're expecting a higher volume for your business, just be on high alert that a criminal is going to know that and they're going to be planning ahead for that as well. So think about your defenses probably needing to be even heightened to protect you around that time. And the second is just any major calendar period. So things like Easter holidays, things like anywhere where your business is going to be stepping down. So that Christmas, New Year's period is a really common one where, like I said earlier, right, criminals get activated during that time because they're excited about the fact that most people are taking a break and probably not as on high alert. So we see a general spike in terms of cyber attacks and attempts that happen during that period. So we often tell businesses your preparedness looks different. Your planning looks different. You are not in your business as usual mode during that time. Your people need to take a break. You need to take holidays just like everybody else, but you need to ramp up your defenses during that time. Absolutely.
Right. And that kind of preempts what was going to be my next question, which was, what do these risk periods look like, based on sector or industry? But it sounds like it's very kind of exactly what you said about, when are those interactions going to increase, and whatever that interaction looks like with consumers or clients, that's the busy period. And unfortunately, I know that some individual consumers have their data stolen, or maybe they're more open on social media, public profiles, et cetera. But generally speaking, I think it is much easier to ascertain the busy periods for certain types of organizations than it is for the average individual walking down the street. So I'm also wondering, these types of scams that we've been talking about that primarily target businesses, are there any misconceptions about them that you wish that leaders knew more about, or there was greater awareness around? Because I know, for instance, what we often see in conversations sometimes with leaders is they say, oh, well, look, if a small scale fraud incident happens and we lose $60,000, we'll just wear the cost. That's actually not enough of a concern for us to really invest in greater defenses to preventing that level of loss. Maybe not always factoring in forensic costs or reputational damage or things like that. So I'm wondering if there are if there are any misconceptions about these types of scams that you've encountered that you think are common or maybe just deserve a bit of airtime.
The first misconception is probably the really simple one, is any business or business owner that thinks it's never going to happen to me. And where I see that the most prevalent in just the general world of anyone who operates a business is particularly those that are running and operating a business that, let's say, is not a well-known consumer brand. And they sort of think, well, who's going to target us? Why would they come after us? The first message I'd have for you is I've seen firsthand actually critical supply chain businesses get disrupted because actually for criminal groups, the well-known brands almost carries a bit of an assumption that they've got large-scale investment into their defenses. But if you're a critical supplier to another large business and you sit sort of behind them, cyber criminal groups have been doing their research into organizations like yours, and they are increasingly thinking, wow, if I go after you, I could probably take down another 50 businesses that you support. As long as you're some kind of critical component of a supply chain, you're a great avenue. And one is probably just because they can assume you'd be in the midst of a lot of, therefore, financial transactions because you're a critical supplier. But the other also is, let's say they were able to penetrate in some way into your organization. They were able to break through, they got through some credentials, and they're actually live in your network. If you're meaningfully connected into another business, let's say you've got actually a data pipe that's connected into another business, you exchange information on a daily basis because that's critical to how you run as a business. That's now just an open pipeline that a threat actor could operate through. So supply chain is a big vector we talk about in the world of cybersecurity in particular, because we often advise organizations, you could just be the footstep to another set of businesses. And so the way you're meaningfully connected from a technology standpoint matters. So you could be a target just as much as that big household brand that you're a provider for. So that's the first thing. The first misconception often is like, why would it be me? And unfortunately, like criminal groups actually have kind of upped the ante as far as their research goes and their knowledge in terms of what kind of critical businesses sit in that supply chain. So that's the first thing. The second is kind of one that you alluded to in your question, which is the real impact and the real cost. So the first thing is, let's say you were scammed out of a certain amount and you consider that as just a bit of a write-off and a loss. Unfortunately, one of the things that's done is it's signaled to that criminal group that you're willing to wear that cost. It makes you a bit of a provocative target for the future. Because once someone pays out, one assumption might be that you have learnt from that and you're going to up your defenses, which is a good thing. We want organizations to go, wow, I never want to have that happen to me again. So now I need to think about what kind of investment do I need to put towards it. If you're not thinking like that every time you've worn that loss, remember that a criminal group's next target might be just you again, There's no reason they don't have an integrity play here. So if they've managed to steal even $1 out of you, why wouldn't they come back tomorrow again for another $1? So that's one component of the real implications of cost. Is one attempt is not going to be a one-off. That same criminal group can also collaborate with other groups that then might perceive you as a target as well. The second is the other part, which is the real consequence costs. So let's say you have lost a significant amount. You've then got to quantify how much is it going to take now to go in and fill those gaps, those vulnerabilities that are around your perimeter, the ways that you haven't been able to protect your business previously, those controls you now need to put in place to prevent it. That none of those come for free, unfortunately. That is an intentional investment that a business must make. We are in countless conversations with enterprises, constantly asking them to think about their level of prioritization. And a helpful way I like to think of it for business is, in your financial management, when you think about what is your total expenses, how much are you spending in total for the technology that underpins your business? Almost no business in Australia right now operates without technology. It's a fundamental underpinning, right? Of that total technology budget that you think is a fundamental, otherwise your business wouldn't be around, think about what percentage of that are you putting towards the security of it. Every large enterprise I work with, that's how they quantify their security budgets. They're thinking of it as a general percentage of their technology investment. Now, that technology investment is about your modernization. It's about being compelling for your customers. It's being up to date. It's doing things that are going to keep you attractive, marketable, and keep you profitable. But what's the point in all of that investment if you can't protect it? What's the point if a cyber criminal could erode all of that in the matter of moments? So if you're not thinking about your yearly budgetary investment towards cybersecurity and protecting it, you're entirely missing a beat. And then you need to think about that in terms of, well, what happens if I don't put that in place? Am I potentially looking at losing my entire business, which in some instances has happened, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's scary. And I think what can be daunting for particularly leaders who are maybe not in the tech space is the idea that, look, yes, I get it. This is a big risk. I would like to do something about it, but I'm not sure where to start. And particularly, I think what is often intimidating is that we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
So how can leaders, particularly ones in maybe the finance function or the AP functions who are maybe a bit more likely to be targeted with some of these tactics, how can leaders in these areas assess their vulnerabilities and understand, where the weaknesses might be in their organization or their function, and what would greater defense even look like?
Yeah, absolutely. The first step is education. And education not just on what are the preventative things out there, but the leaders that I've seen as an example who I think have done a really good job in terms of being proactive, in terms of really seeking out how to find what those gaps and vulnerabilities are the ones that have been willing to read about the instances where things have gone wrong. So every time there's been a news report of someone falling for a large scam, actually going in and having that research and reading about it, there's a level of curiosity actually that's needed to be defensive about that threat type. I kind of look at it as no different to, you look at the weather report to best be able to prepare and plan around a business that, let's say, is entirely dependent on good weather. You would always be doing your research proactively. You're not just going to kind of wait for bad weather to show up. Why wouldn't you go out and read about some of the instances where large-scale scam and fraud has happened to then be able to be informed, use that as almost like an imitation example and run that through your own business processes? And think about, actually, if this same scenario was applied to my business, where are my drawbacks in my process? One simple thing that I often think a lot of finance leaders could benefit from is the main merchant bank that's supporting you, or any of the providers that help you do your payments, whether it's credit card transactions, whether it's any financial management, is don't hesitate to have a conversation with those providers about what security practices they have in place. Why wouldn't you want to know about how they're protecting you? So, for example, there are some banks that if there is a transaction an individual or a business is making for the first time to an account they've never made one to before, as a preventative measure, some of those banks will put it in a 24-hour hold, which means that transaction won't happen immediately. Now, as a business owner and an operator, you'd want to know, one, how does that impact your business? Because for some people, real-time payments is really critical. But on the flip side, what level of protection is that actually adding to your business? If something were to accidentally, just through human error, go to the wrong amount or the wrong account and you've just potentially lost thousands of dollars, do you know the procedures that your bank would put in place to protect you? Have you thought about, well, if you got in contact with them immediately, generally, what procedures do banks have in place to protect you around that? Do you know the contact point? Do you have someone advising you? So feel the confidence first on educating yourself around how these things happen. And there's a host of information available publicly, like things like cyber.gov.au or the National Anti-Scam Centre. Great places to start just to read about what do these threat types look like? What are the common types of threats like the ones we've spoken about today? And then when those news stories kind of come up, like I'm an enthusiast, so I'm subscribed to every news channel with the word cyber or scam in it. You maybe don't have to go to that degree, but when you do come across those stories, have a read of them because they're incredibly illuminating about how some of these things fall through the gaps. I often tell people, no silver bullet's been established to stop this thing from happening. There's a reason why we hear numbers like $3 billion lost to Australians. It's because no solution has been concretely put in place where no gap can go through. It means we've got a bit of a race at the moment between educating people and putting in technology and hopefully a combination of those things to try and prevent this stuff as much as possible. But there's clearly no silver bullet. So the more you can see when these things do eventually happen, the better you can prevent yourself from being able to go through it. One example that I think was a really interesting one that was reported recently was sort of in the home lending and conveyancing space where a couple, I think, lost something like $500,000 or potentially somewhere around that figure. And it was basically through them making a large deposit payment towards buying their property, which, as you can imagine, from an individual point of view, the story initially read, and to me, I was interested in it to understand how this couple lost such a significant amount. By the end of the story, actually, I found it really illuminating as a lesson for businesses. Because what had happened was the conveyancer they were working with or the broker they were working with had their email account intercepted and compromised. Somehow a criminal group had clearly been able to maybe guess the combination of username or password or probably scraped it from another website they've been using those same credentials of. Long story short, made their way into their email account, had uncovered that this couple had already been in an email exchange communication about making 2 deposit payments, split over 2 transactions, really large ones, and had made the first one, were due to make their second one. Unfortunately, that communication between the couple and that e-conveyancer was disrupted by the criminal who sent that couple an email. Everything looked the same. The body of the email header, the contents of the email just looked so familiar and so easily manipulatable that basically the only thing that they had done was just change the account number and BSB that they asked the couple to send that follow-up transaction to. And that transaction went to a completely different account, and before you know it, they've lost an incredible amount of their life savings towards a property. So a very, very disappointing and sad consequence for that couple. But the lesson for the businesses here is, imagine if that's your business. And we don't have to use home loans as an example. It could be any business. How many businesses in Australia right now communicate large transactions through emails? So if you're a finance leader or you're someone that's responsible for accounts payments, think about what additional steps could you do to make sure that every time somebody needs to make a payment, whether it's you making a payment or someone making a payment to you, how can you add another level of verification? Or how can you take that communication off just email? Because the fact that it can be so easily intercepted, and I say easily with a caveat that yes, there are controls in place. Yes, technology giants like Microsoft put better controls in place for Outlook, but it's not impenetrable. Cyber criminals are still finding their ways around it. What additional processes could you put in place so that the next time we're talking about large sums of money in the simplest way, we can actually make sure it's legitimately you and it's going to the legitimately right account? Because those are the instances that probably terrify me the most because we're talking about the losses of quite large numbers.
Yeah, it's so confronting to think about something like that because I think we've all just trusted an existing email chain. Maybe not even to make payments, but you click on links or you kind of just assume that because you've already been in communication with this, what you think is a trusted contact, you kind of just continue on and you don't necessarily question it. And then we think, I can't believe this person fell for a scam. We have a lot of stigma and I think a lot of stereotypes around scams and who falls for scams and what that actually looks like, when in actuality, it can be so much more sophisticated. And sometimes it's just a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
100%.
And it could potentially happen to anyone. And so I'm wondering, are there any other warning signs? Because we've just talked about how difficult it would be to suddenly go, this person I've been communicating with they're not actually the same person that's communicating with me from this same channel. What are other warning signs that we can kind of take into consideration, whether businesses or individuals? What does that look like?
Yeah, the same sort of principles apply with businesses and individuals in many ways. Because we don't have just a simplistic layer of protection where we can go to sleep at night and assume this will never happen to us. A lot of it is about your digital footprint and the information that you've got out there, and thinking about being really mindful about what exists. For businesses, it's also probably another level where they should think about all the information they're storing and whether they truly need to hold on to all of that information. There are so many instances and cases of when businesses have unfortunately been compromised and they've had a criminal steal large amounts of their data, that so much of it was historic and redundant data that, let's say, isn't critical to them continuing to be able to run their business. What happens in a lot of instances is it's not a malicious thing, and it's not by any intention, but a lot of businesses are just running and operating using large data sets about their consumers, about their footprints, about, let's say, their marketing patterns, etc., to help inform future business decisions. And that's absolutely necessary. But some of that historic data, let's say that's got particularly sensitive information in it, if it's not critical to you being able to make those immediate decisions for your business, there's a really important hygiene step. And unfortunately, businesses just never get around to prioritizing it because it never falls as part of, the top 10 things that they're thinking about that quarter or that year, because there's so many other understandable high priorities for a business, to stay profitable, to stay afloat. So I'm sympathetic that some of these things can just feel like just another burden. And I certainly wouldn't want organizations to feel like they just have to tick a box because, let's say, it's a compliance requirement. But actually, I'm hoping that businesses will start thinking about data as a real foundational necessity, both in terms of things that will make them successful. Like, we've got businesses that come to us, for example, saying, hey, AI is all the buzz. How do I use this thing? And how do I make it a really amazing thing for my business and for my customers? How do I make my processes more efficient? And I always sort of go, let's take a step back to your data. AI is only as good as the data you give it, and how well structured and well thought about is your data footprint and the way that you've structured it in your business. When we've got that at a level which is quite clean and easy and simple to use, then we can think about how to then use things like AI. The same concept applies from protecting yourself from a security point of view. Really think about that data footprint and that data hygiene and whether you really need to hold on to some of that data that you've got, because once it's compromised, it's not just about the theft, but some of it could be the loss of trust of your own consumers. We saw, in Australia, the likes of large-scale data breaches like the Optus, the Medibank, the Latitudes. A lot of it didn't have like a necessarily super negative impact in terms of the profitability of those businesses. They were able to rebuild trust. But if you think about how much time and money and energy they would have had to spend to rebuild that trust, to give their customers assurance that they were taking it seriously, that they were focusing on cybersecurity and fraud, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And so for smaller businesses that don't have that opportunity, it's really important to think about how quickly trust can erode. And if any of your consumers feel like you've been the recipient of like a cyber attack where you've lost their data, even though you could have done everything that you could have, for them, it's still going to feel like you're not a trusted service anymore. So a lot of it is thinking about that data footprint. For individuals and for businesses, one thing that we always recommend is like having a really strong line of sight over your finances. Just a good protective measure is thinking about those transactions and your payments and that inflow and outflow, and doing it in a really hygienic way, because you never know when you're actually able to catch something that looks suspicious, that has come through, that looks unusual, and have a way to be able to detect those anomalies. Have a really good structured process around when you expect the inflow and outflow of transactions, so that when you're able to do that as a semi-regular check that you do, all of that adds up. And don't ignore those signs when something looks suspicious. And then the last one would be your customers. Your customers will pick up on things that look unusual. They're a great line of defense. We've seen, there was an example last year where I saw, just a fashion retailer had someone spoof their website, and they were able to reach their known customers actually just through a social media ad. And when customers fell for that, they went and bought what they thought were just clothes from the brand that they've always known and trusted, and then never had the clothes sent to them. So they basically had all their money just sent off to a criminal that they didn't realize at that time was being spoofed. What I saw was really interesting was the CEO and the founder of the legitimate business having to come on social media and then publish videos basically saying, I'm not behind this. I haven't stole your money. It's not that I would just steal your money and never send you your products. Unfortunately, we've been spoofed. What it did temporarily was we got those customers in a place where they were like, I'm not even sure now when I access your website, is it really you? And how do I feel trusted? So really being acutely aware that your customers might actually be reaching out to you at some point, communicating with you that they maybe have done a transaction or they're interacting with you through your various channels. That might actually allude to something that might be a spoofing attempt, or they might have been phished, it's really, really important to have your ear to the ground, because you might not always pick up on these things yourselves, but your customers might actually be a great avenue to be able to be informed about it and then be able to act quickly, respond. Because I think that's been a big fundamental shift in public sentiment is it's not about a business falling for the compromise in the first place, but it's how they respond and how they get on top of it and how they give comfort back to the end consumer that they're being quite proactive about it.
Yeah, and it is a tricky one, and I'm sympathetic because you mentioned the data hygiene and the storage and everything, and I feel like for decades it was just a constant chatter about how you need to get as much data as you can and then use that to create as many seamless experiences as you possibly can. And then it turns out, I think in the last maybe 4 to 5 years, there's been the pendulum is starting to shift, and now businesses are starting to go, oh, actually, this is a liability. And regulators are also starting to really crack down and tighten, like you mentioned, that historical data. And yes, customers want seamless experiences. They want it to be easy. They're looking for convenience, but they're also looking to feel that they can trust you when they give you, sensitive documents like ID and everything, especially because for those individuals who are impacted, it might be easy for a very large brand, like you mentioned, to rebuild that trust, but it's very hard for the average person to go, oh, well, my sensitive medical data is now on the dark web. How do I change that? I can't just change certain things about my identification, about my identity, and now that's something it's a liability for me, and then they have to kind of carry that, and it's not as easily remedied. So I think that then, we've had a lot of conversations, I think, generally about what businesses can be doing to better look after their consumers and protect them from these sorts of incidents. But there's also this broader conversation happening around liability and where that sits. And I know it's a very thorny conversation, so we don't have to get too much into it, but I'm wondering, when it comes to scam losses in particular, what does liability look like right now?
Yeah, so it's a great topic actually, and very timely at the moment in terms of scams happen, and fundamentally there's victims, and then there's a finger pointing scenario on, well, who owes that victim? And I think the best way to sort of have this part of the conversation is, again, to come back to the complexity that is a scam. Because I hear the word like scam liability thrown around a lot, and there's a lot of dialogue about it, but I think where it needs to sort of start is remember that the victim is the person, unfortunately, who's been convinced. They think they're doing something legitimate. That's the first thing. It's not the instance where they're not even a participant in the exercise. Those are very, very different cases. So when we're talking about like identity theft, you're not even an active participant in that. Someone has stolen your information, they've gone and accessed, let's say, your accounts, and they've stolen your money, and you were none the wiser. In a scam, it's actually you making that transaction or that email or whatever it is that the scammer is trying to get you to do. So when we then talk about liability, now you have to try and imagine, well, which organization is accountable to pick up on the fact that you're potentially about to commit, like you're part of a scam and that you've been manipulated. And then when we talk about what is a reasonable effort that organization should make to stop that from happening. The first thing is, well, let's say just for example, I'm making a transfer to you. You're actually a scammer, but you've imitated yourself so convincingly that I think what I'm doing is legitimate. And let's say you've also created a sense of urgency that if I don't do this, there's a consequence I should be worried about, which is a very common tactic and technique, right? So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to log into my internet banking and I'm going to make this transaction. First of all, there's some red flags that should occur with my major bank, which is it's an account number that's not familiar. Maybe it's an individual that I haven't really transferred to. And let's say it's an amount that they don't typically see me doing. Like I don't make big, 6-figure transfers anytime during these types of weeks or months, and everything about this just seems odd. Some of the things that like a bank could do is put a bit of friction in place to say everything about these parameters about what you're doing doesn't seem right. Those parameters, I think, are good, reasonable steps to say, well, this is the known information that institution has about you, and they have the power to be able to add some friction and potentially stop you from being scammed. The second step is actually having a conversation with you, which we know some of the banks now do, which is they'll pick up the phone, they'll get someone in the fraud team to call you and say, hey, you've just tried to make this potential transaction come through. It then requires me to explain what I'm doing. Now, we've seen a bit of an interesting divisive response here where some individuals feel like this is a bit intrusive because they're like, leave me alone, I just want to make my transaction. But then when they've fallen victim, they're like, wait, my institution should have stopped this from happening. So there is an incumbency where we expect the banks to be able to intervene. And in this instance, I should be able to get a phone call where someone should try and question me a little bit on like, why do you think this is urgent? And ask those really important questions because the banks have seen how these scam activity has happened before. And there's some familiar footprints of like, is it out of urgency? Are you 100% sure it's the individual you think it is? Have you gone and actually validated that it's absolutely that person or that business that's made contact with you? How do you know it's really them? Have you double-checked that email? All of those kinds of questions could be a great interventionist point for that scam from stopping from happening. These are all things that I think are a really good vector to think about when we then talk about who has liability and then how is that liability acted on. Now, the conversation that's happening right now in terms of between government and industry is in the events where that friction hasn't worked, or let's say those things weren't applied because some institutions don't have all of those controls in place, when that loss has happened and it's irretrievable, who's accountable for refunding that victim? And where this becomes a multi-industry discussion is, let's say the scam actually happened through like a text message. Now that involves my telco, because should my telco have known that that is a known criminal number where a lot of this suspicious activity comes from? And then there's a conversation about the speed to act. How quickly could that telco identify that, hey, that text message you just got probably should have been blocked because it's a known bad actor and we should have blocked that text message. Let's say they've missed that boat. How quickly can they then communicate that to the bank to then make sure that my financial institution knows that if I'm going to make this transaction, I've possibly been on the receiving end of a bad number and a bad contact. All of that multi-industry collaboration results in potentially the prevention and the mitigation of these scams from happening in the first place. So like I said, the liability conversation to me is an interesting one because we start to actually unravel and unpack a little bit more on what are the prevention methodologies that we expect out of our organizations to protect individuals and businesses, and what's the bare minimum that should be in place? When those bare minimum activities have not happened, then it's an interesting conversation about the consequences. Then it should be a conversation about who actually should be supporting that victim. Because the minute telcos, banks, technology organizations at scale have to pay back victims, I guarantee you they're going to be starting to think more and more about the investment towards prevention, because now they're actually physically having to pay back that victim. The other reason the liability conversation, certainly in Australia, is a little bit different to, let's say, how we've seen it play out in the UK, where the dominant liability discussion has been about banks, is in Australia, I think it's taking a bit more of an evolved approach, where the government is certainly thinking about, well, it is multi-industry. So if it took, let's say, a number of these participants for that scam to happen, do we split liability amongst them? So that's a really interesting, I think, permutation. I think it's a good live discussion that's happening. And I think it spotlights that whilst banks predominantly facilitate financial transactions and probably will always have a bit of a heavier burden to do prevention because they kind of see these transactions as they happen and have the ability to prevent them, it really puts a spotlight on all the other players that are there that are becoming a facilitative channel for cyber criminals, and what is their responsibilities to take down these bad actors and these bad behaviours as they happen, and how quickly can they prevent around it as well. So that's my sort of long-winded summary on liabilities. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I think it's a good watching space. And I think if there's anything positive that can actually be taken out of this really complex discussion is it's great that we're talking about it. As someone who's been in this industry, and there are hundreds of people in my industry in this country that have been at the forefront of fighting cybercrime, it's actually great that we have this so publicised, that consumers know about it. They're actually actively talking about prevention. The more we actually talk about it, the more I have more comfort that everyday Australians probably have a little bit better chance of actually being able to circumvent around it, being able to see some of these threats coming, and actually be able to not fall for these as much as they unfortunately have previously.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as someone who sees the inner workings of cybercrime so often, it must be kind of heartening to know that these conversations are helping kind of shed a light on those inner workings. Yeah. And when we get down to brass tacks and go, okay, whose fault was this? And then we start breaking down, okay, well, yes, the bank facilitated the payment, but then we've also got, let's say, for instance, we've got a telco, or we've got a social media platform that was facilitating some other element of the scam. Then I think it starts to really illuminate, something that you mentioned before was that a lot of this is very complex.
Yeah.
The ecosystems are complex, the scams are complex and draw on both maybe some technical aspects as well as psychological aspects. So we've got layers on layers on layers.
Yeah.
And once we start talking about all those different layers, not even in a necessarily a finger pointing way, but then we start to like understand what the layers actually are.
Absolutely.
And I think that really does help us understand and then prevent things a little bit better.
I think so. I think one positive vector I've certainly seen that's been, I think, really encouraging, and actually it's a great learning for businesses in particular, is the public sentiment around it has been one of like fear and almost a feeling of defeatism previously. Now there's a bit more hope because I think we're far more aware of what prevention looks like and what organizations are doing to try and mitigate around it. And a good example I find is even just people in my own personal circle, whether it's friends or extended family, etc. I've noticed the general discussion and dialogue towards people feeling more empowered to enable better protection themselves really increase. And it often makes me think about, previously I think businesses are rightfully towed on how do we create a really seamless experience and one that's frictionless. So for example, if you're a business that has any avenue where a customer has to authenticate themselves or log into something because you've got an online presence, for example, it's been fascinating for me seeing friends and family talk about how they've willingly enabled MFA when they've had the opportunity to, or the fact that they feel more secure when their iPhone pings with a biometric scan or like a Face ID scan. And that extra layer of protection, they're very happy and willing to voluntarily take it up because for them if it's just in one extra step, but it gives me that level of protection and some comfort that no one else can steal my identity and be able to log in on my behalf because I've added this extra layer of protection. That's a great thing. And so I hope that it's been therefore encouraging for businesses to think about that more. I think where we've like some of the examples that kind of irk me, but I'm a cyber purist, so obviously this would be something that's bothersome, is, I've got accounts with some retailers that, never require you to change your password or make it more complex, as an example, or they don't have an option for me to be able to have a second layer of authentication. And I think to myself, but you're a place where you might be storing my financial information, my personal home address. You've got so much sensitive information about me. Why do you not have an extra layer of protection than when I'm logging in? So I think it's a good time actually for businesses to think about that. I think because public sentiment has changed and people are so much more passionate about protecting themselves, I think business should feel a little bit more empowered to talk to their technology partners and providers about what extra protection looks like, because I think it actually helps create more trust. And I think it's actually a stronger brand reputation when customers are like, oh, wow, like this XYZ company is actually asking me to do another security level check. This is great. Whereas before, I think it was, why are you making me go through an extra step? That's really annoying. So I'm hoping that, we've seen a bit of a turning point for businesses actually as well.
I think we've kind of already, we've touched on the preventative changes that organizations can make, as well as, what they can do to protect themselves, as well as protect their customers, their clients, their partners elsewhere in the supply chain or in the ecosystem. So I feel like we've already touched on quite a lot of that. But as we start to wrap up, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would want leaders to know about upping their defenses, mitigating their risks, and taking a better approach to some of these problems.
Yeah, I think if at the end of this podcast you're sort of thinking, what do I do next? I gave a couple of sort of encouragement pieces before, which is like, do your research, learn about what's out there, get some insights. One helpful activity would be definitely catalog, for your own sanity's sake, with your organization, what are the level of defenses exist at the moment? And I would put them in two general buckets because I think they're the easiest. Is one, look at it from a human point of view, and the other, look at it from a technology point of view. And the easiest way to simplify those two is the technology stuff should be the stuff that just constantly operates, almost like the security cameras that are just on. They're just always on and they're doing their job 24/7, so you don't have to proactively sit there overlooking it. But then your humans are, think of that as the component that I always sort of describe as your greatest potential weakness, because they're the ones that might make the human error, or they're the ones that might get spearfished. They might be the ones that fall victim to it, but they're actually therefore your greatest defense if you educate them properly. So when you think about those two categories, it'd be really great to catalog what you think you've already got in place, and then that might actually educate you on what are the potential gaps. So things that I would recommend businesses do is, no matter your employee size, whether we're talking about organizations with the 10,000 plus, or whether you've got 3 people running your business, what education is available to them to know about what basic security hygiene looks like? How do you educate them so that they know what suspicious looks like? Every time you see, like the banks actually do this quite well, where they publish what scams look like. Like they'll publish, on their websites examples. And I often think if you came across a spoofing scam where your business was actually being spoofed, can you communicate that to all of your employees? Like send it to them so that they know that this exists. The more there's a tactile level of like interactivity with this topic, the more people digest it and the more they actually would, if they get confronted with it, will have a better muscle memory to actually be able to respond to it. And generally create an atmosphere, because you spoke about stigma earlier, and this is a big thing that comes up a lot in our industry is the more you can make people feel comfortable to interact with it and remove the stigma, the more you actually ignite a bit of a proactive mindset in your employees. Because every time they see something suspicious, they're going to speak up. They're going to come and report it. They're going to do something about it. And therefore, the less likely they are to fall for it, and the better you are going to be able to have is a chance to prevent more of that happening in the future. So the human side, so incredibly important. Put education in place and then give them the tools. And that kind of brings us into the second category. So once you've been able to really establish the human side of things and be able to enable and empower your people, then we can actually start looking at some of the tooling and the technologies that you can put in place, both to support them with their day-to-day business activities, but also be able to put things in place that are just there and they're keeping your business secure. So from a human point of view, I often recommend putting in some level of extra authentication. If you're a small-sized business or you're a medium-sized business and you look at the entire footprint of all your devices that your employees are using on a daily basis to run and operate your business, at a basic level, if any of those devices were lost, could a complete stranger open them up and get direct access straight away? By avoiding that, you could put in things like MFA, which would then require an extra level of authentication and therefore an extra level of comfort that only your actual employees will be able to get in, and the people who need access get access. The same concept of multi-factor authentication is applied to sometimes your critical applications. So even if I was able to, let's say, log in to a device, there should be an extra step for me to be able to get into my sensitive applications. Let's say your CRM or anywhere where you've got your sensitive operations or your sensitive customer information. If you can add another layer of protection, that can be incredibly valuable. And we've seen it definitely circumvent a lot of cyber criminal attempts where they're hoping to get in just on credentials, just a combination of a username and a password, because unfortunately they've got things like brute force technologies and capabilities that allows them to just go through thousands of password combinations, particularly with some assumptions built in maybe because they know a little bit about the individual. And it doesn't take them basically a very long time to be able to get through those controls. And so MFA acts as a really, really beneficial next step to circumvent certainly those types of attacks. The other things on technology front is have a really good conversation with your technology partners and your main technology providers that help to run and sustain your business. There's basic level of encryption standards they could put in place for when you're sending and receiving information and data. There's basic security firewalls you could put in place. There's things that you could do that protect your network perimeter. There's a lot of basically foundational cyber controls that can be put in place through some conversations with either security actual providers. You can reach out to organizations like CyberCX, shameless plug, that can come in and talk to you about, hey, even just the genesis of where do I start? How do I even know what good looks like? What do I have in place? Can you do like a gap assessment or a vulnerability assessment to understand where I don't have protections in place and how could they be exploited if you're really struggling to even know where to start? Those could be some of the simple places to start. But yeah, really thinking about your business as a full footprint in every place that you operate, in every digital footprint that you have, is having a level of comfort around how you protect that and secure that as best as possible. And the last one is, again, really have to hone in on this because the topic is about scams, how you communicate and interact with your customers, how you manage your high-risk transactions, and what processes you can put in place to make sure that, it's authorized employees that help do that activity, that it's a really secure environment where that activity is happening in place, and then what kind of procedures and processes do you have in place should things go wrong, and how do you mitigate around them the best that you possibly can.
Amazing. Those are incredibly helpful next steps. I think on a smaller scale, regarding next steps, for anybody who wants to hear more from you and find out more about you or the services that you offer at CyberCX, where can they find you? Where should they go?
The first place to go, and rather than me, I would love for them to go to CyberCX's website, cybercrime.com.au, just because there's just a whole host of information we constantly publish. We're an organization of like 1,500 plus fanatics, but we also publish a lot of our insights, and it's all freely and readily available. So please go and have a look and see some of those resources. We talk about things that are like the common threads that businesses should look out for, but we also talk about some of the regulatory landscape. So if you're curious about, the new standards and policies that the regulator is looking towards, and you're thinking about how that might impact your business, or, what are the descriptions of a bare minimum of what good looks like, we've got a host of information there. And then there's more depth and webinars and videos and things like that. A great place to follow is also on LinkedIn. So CyberCX has their own channel. We publish often the topics that not just myself, but a lot of our thought leaders are talking about constantly. And yeah, on LinkedIn is a great place. That's where I post a lot of stuff. I talk about the latest and greatest things in our industry, and also just it's a great platform just to talk about some of these emerging threats and the new vectors that are being spoken about, talked about, some of the terrible stories that are out there, and what we think of it, and how we advise organizations to just be on alert and aware.
Amazingly helpful. We'll link those resources in the show notes. Shameela, thank you so much. This was very informative and educational for me, and I'm super excited to share it with everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening to the latest episode of On the Defense. If you'd like to find out more about F-Shore, you can follow us on LinkedIn or head to www.fshore.com. Thanks again.